Hey, I want to talk a little bit about just the basic steps of design thinking, and I'm just going to walk through each of these. And we're going to do each of these items that I'm just going to share real quickly. We're going to do each of these in much more in depth as we walk through the first couple of weeks of the course. Okay, so but this is really just to kind of orient you a little bit to what each of these of the steps attached to design thinking really are. Okay, and so really the process begins with the empathize component. Okay, and so um, and it should. This is the one piece of the two pieces that always need to be first. Okay, when you're starting a design thinking process, you'll note that we talked a little bit more about the process itself. It's not like the kind of thing that you necessarily walk through each of these steps in order every time that you go through this cycle. Okay, but in the design thinking process itself, you always need to start with the empathize component. Okay, so generally speaking, particularly when you're being hired in as a designer by somebody else to help you work through a process, or and I say, they are hiring you for a reason, right? They have a problem, right? Or they have an idea that they think might be something that would lead to good business or something like that, right? So that's generally speaking how this whole thing begins, right? But the reality is they wouldn't be they wouldn't be hiring you or thinking about these things and asking for help if they knew for sure, right? And so the idea is like, hey, I've got this. This is something that I think is important that needs some consideration. And then what the process really begins with, and this is the human centered component of it, right? Is really you're like, you know what? But we really need to know and understand more about the needs and desires of people in order to ensure that what we think might be the problem or opportunity really is the problem or opportunity, right? So that empathizing component is really important, and most partly because, and truly doing it well is really important because most often when you're coming into the empathizing, when you're doing the empathizing exercise, right? Um, the people that you're working for, remember you have some ideas already in your head about what the issue is, right? And at some level, you need to take all of that and push it aside, okay? And you need to reserve judgment on all of it, right? You need to suspend any type of judgment you have whatsoever in order to ensure that you're really listening to the people that are at the end of the experience that you need to know that you're building something for, right? And so you might find through this process that the idea that you think is really at the root of it really isn't at all, right? When you start listening more deeply and really digging deeper into the activities and kind of watching how people do things and so on. Because what you'll find is even if something's coming out of the person's mouth, like I believe this is the case, but then you watch them and actively in the process, you'll note that their actions don't necessarily match up with what they say they believe, right? And so it's sometimes you have to really kind of like really get in and kind of go, no, we're not understanding this well enough yet in order to kind of come to terms with what the real issue is. Okay, so that's why the empathizing piece is so darn important because it's really kind of getting people, human beings, in their element, talking and observing, how things really operate in the real world, right? With all the imperfections that the real world holds. Okay, and through that, then you get to the defining component, right, where you've been able to kind of do some discerning and watching and learning, and then you're thinking about now what really is at play here, right? Is it an emotion that's really kind of controlling this? Are there extenuating circumstances that are attached to this that really are driving decision making? That, and is it that at the heart of what we're really talking about, right? And so that defining piece is really, really, really important in terms of like saying, like, you know, we've been looking at this and studying this and observing people and doing all this part where we thought this might be really what's at play here. That is at play, but it's at play because of this, right? And so that defining piece becomes really a crystallization of all of the listening that you've done in the empathizing piece, right? And that crystallization is really important, and that it's that articulation needs to be really really succinct and actionable, right? And sometimes it's in the form of a question. It's not a statement like "this was what we learned." Woo! You know, it's like, "Hey, this is what we think is happening here. How do we go about solving this problem?" Right? So you're defining that, right? You're not necessarily defining the solution sometimes. Most often you're defining the problem, okay? And that then, the beautiful thing is through that process then, you're like, okay, we really understand what we're really after now. Now let's go think creatively in the ideate component, right? Really sort of brainstorming and thinking outside the box and kind of recognizing all the human interactivity and so on, and saying, how can we solve this creatively, right? How can we get at that issue that we've just defined most creatively, or taking the best approach? It doesn't necessarily have to be creative, but you're really looking to get at how can we do this the best, right? And so that ideate component is what some people really think of as the fun stage, right? Is because you're just thinking about all the possibilities, right, of how we can go about kind of coming to terms with and addressing this issue that we've defined, right? At some point through that ideation, then, right, you start to kind of funnel those ideas into like something that congeals, right? Like okay, now we're getting somewhere, right? This is where the creative process is taking us, and we believe that we want to build this, right? And so you start out by prototyping whatever that is, right? And that prototype, generally speaking, is really simple, right? You're just kind of coming up with a visual or some small artifact, a tiny little model, whatever it is, that then you can take from like, okay, we've come up with that. Now let's take it to the testing component, right? And seeing what people think, seeing how people manage with it, and seeing if it works the way we think it might work, right? And starting that process of just teasing out that prototype a little bit to try and build the next model, right? The next best, the next best, the next best, right? And so sometimes, even though this figure eight shows that you end up going back to the empathizing component after you're through testing, oftentimes what happens is you just stay over and you prototype test, ideate, prototype test for a bit, right? Through the first couple iterations of prototyping, and then after you've got some experience and you've iterated a couple of designs, you've kind of come through it a couple of times, then you make your way back to the empathizing. And it's not like you're ever losing track of the empathizing, but sometimes the model isn't, just like I said, as pure as what you're seeing here on paper. Okay, so I just wanted to, again, kind of walk you briefly through the stages that we're going to explore together throughout the rest of this course, so you have a basic understanding, and now we'll get into more depth as we move forward.